There's a river in northern India where, for generations, people vanish without a trace. No bodies, no warning, just a ripple on the surface, and then nothing. Locals had a name for what took them, and in 2005, a British biologist waded into that river to find out if the legend was real. What he pulled out of the water that day would eventually become one of the most successful documentary formats in television history. But 9 seasons later, at the peak of its popularity, that same show vanished almost as suddenly as the swimmers it was named after. No dramatic finale, no scandal, no warning. Just gone. 4 years. The official story was simple. The host had run out of monsters to catch. But if you actually look at what Jeremy Wade has said, in his own words, across interviews and his own writing, the real picture is more interesting than any single tidy explanation, and definitely stranger than most of what gets repeated about him online. So let's talk about who Jeremy Wade actually is, what he actually built, and what actually happened to river monsters. Long before there were cameras anywhere near him, Jeremy Wade was already the kind of person most television producers would consider impossible to invent. He was born in Ipswich in 1956 and grew up in the village of Nayland in Suffolk, where his father worked as a vicar. The house he grew up in sat close to the River Stour, and that river is where his obsession started, not with monsters, but with the ordinary business of a boy given a cheap fishing rod at around 7 or 8 years old. He wasn't from a family of anglers. Nobody handed him a tradition. He built the obsession himself, one afternoon at a time, with the help of a school friend who taught him how to actually catch something instead of just staring at still water. That obsession followed him into adulthood in a very unusual way. Instead of turning fishing into a hobby he did on weekends, Wade turned it into the organizing principle of his entire life. He studied zoology at the University of Bristol, then went on to earn a postgraduate teaching certificate in biological sciences from the University of Kent. For a while, he did exactly what a science graduate in England was supposed to do. He taught biology at a secondary school. But the pull toward remote water never let go of him, and in 1982 he made a decision that would define the next 4 decades. He got on a plane to India to fish rivers that almost nobody outside those regions had ever studied for their fish populations, let alone fished. From that point on, Wade lived a life that reads less like a biography and more like an adventure novel someone would reject for being too far-fetched. He funded his travels by working as a secondary school teacher, a newspaper reporter, an advertising copywriter, a construction laborer, a farmhand, a translator, and even a dishwasher, saving what he could between trips to fund the next one. He taught himself Portuguese specifically so he could work more effectively in Brazil, reportedly studying it for hours a day for months before a trip to the Amazon. Over the years that followed, he was arrested on suspicion of being a spy in Southeast Asia, contracted cerebral malaria while working in the Congo, survived a plane crash in the Amazon, and found himself facing down an armed threat during one of his expeditions. None of that happened for a television crew. It happened because he was already doing this work, alone and mostly unknown, for roughly 20 years before anyone in television took an interest. That interest finally arrived properly in 2005, during a trip to the Himalayan foothills of India. Wade had heard local accounts of people disappearing in a river, and villagers were convinced a giant fish was responsible. He investigated, and eventually landed an enormous goonch catfish, weighing over 160 pounds, in a fight that became the seed of an entire television format. It wasn't just a good fishing story. It was proof of concept for something new, real detective work, applied to the natural world, with a genuine biologist doing the investigating instead of an actor reading a script. River Monsters premiered on Animal Planet in 2009, and it was an immediate hit, quickly becoming one of the network's most-watched series ever. Part of what made it different from other nature programming was structural. Each episode functioned like a mystery. Wade would arrive somewhere following reports of an attack or disappearance, gather testimony from witnesses, weigh the biological evidence, narrow down a list of suspects, and then attempt to catch the creature responsible, using his decades of specialized knowledge rather than dramatic staging. Over 9 seasons, that format introduced global audiences to creatures most people had never even heard of: the Goliath tigerfish of the Congo with its piranha-like teeth, the electric eel capable of producing hundreds of volts, giant freshwater stingrays weighing well over 1,000 pounds, and bull sharks capable of swimming far upriver into fresh water most people assumed was safe. The show aired in more than 200 countries and became something of a gateway series for a generation of viewers who went on to study marine biology, zoology, and conservation. So why did it end? This is where a lot of recent online content gets things wrong, sometimes deliberately. Over the past year or so, a wave of articles and videos have circulated claiming Wade secretly hated the show, that the network silenced an environmental message he was desperate to tell, that he broke down crying at a dead river, that there's a specific chapter in his memoir confessing to lying to his audience for 9 years. None of that holds up. It isn't supported by any interview, any excerpt from his actual 2019 book, How to Think Like a Fish, or any statement from Animal Planet. It's a storyline that keeps getting repeated across similar-sounding posts, which is usually a sign that nobody involved actually did the reporting. They just copied each other. What Wade has actually said, on the record, is far less conspiratorial, though it's still meaningful. In a press statement around the show's conclusion, he explained it plainly. Some shows can run forever, but the subject matter he was covering is finite. There are only so many documented cases of unusual freshwater attacks, only so many candidate species behind them, and by the 9th season, he had methodically worked through the most compelling cases across the Amazon, the Congo, the rivers of Southeast Asia, and beyond. He wasn't chasing ratings decline or network conflict. He had built the show around solving a specific category of mystery, and after 9 seasons and roughly 60 episodes, that specific well had largely been worked through. Continuing to manufacture new mysteries once the genuinely compelling cases have been covered would have meant compromising the exact thing that made the show credible in the first place. That every investigation was grounded in a real report, a real community, and real biology, not invented drama. That doesn't mean environmental change played no role in his thinking, because it clearly did, just not in the shape of a hidden confession. Anyone who has watched River Monsters closely across its run can notice a shift in tone as the season progressed. Wade increasingly used his platform to talk about the pressures facing the rivers he was filming in: pollution, damming, overfishing, and the disappearance of species he had personally studied for years. That focus didn't stop when River Monsters ended. It deepened. In 2018, Wade returned to television with Mighty Rivers, a documentary series built explicitly around the health of the world's major river systems, including the Amazon, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Mississippi, the Danube, and the Mekong. Instead of framing each episode as a hunt for a dangerous creature, Mighty Rivers examined how human activity was reshaping these ecosystems and pushing giant freshwater species toward collapse. In 2019, he followed that with Dark Waters, a series exploring long-standing reports of unexplained creatures and mysterious sightings around the world, applying the same investigative rigor that had made River Monsters work in the first place. Both shows reflected a real and well-documented evolution in what Wade wanted to communicate to his audience, even if neither one matched the runaway popularity of the original series. That gap in popularity is itself worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something true about audiences without needing to be dressed up as a secret betrayal. River Monsters offered mystery, tension, and a satisfying resolution in each episode. Mighty Rivers and Dark Waters asked viewers to sit with more complicated, slower-moving problems, the kind that don't resolve neatly in 4 to 4 minutes. Both approaches came from the same person, doing the same kind of honest fieldwork, just aimed at different questions. One chased a specific unsolved mystery. The other examined a much larger, ongoing one. Neither required Wade to have been lying about the first show in order for the second one to matter.
It's also worth being clear about who Wade actually is outside the mythology that's built up around him, because the real details are more impressive than the invented ones. He speaks several languages, including fluent Portuguese from his years working in Brazil, along with French and some Spanish. He has fished for and caught an extraordinary range of species across his career, from giant devil catfish in India to enormous arapaima and piraiba in the Amazon, from Goliath tigerfish in the Congo to alligator gar and giant sturgeon in the United States, from freshwater stingrays across 3 continents to bull sharks far up rivers in South Africa. He's had underwater encounters with Nile crocodiles and full-sized anacondas, not staged for effect, but as part of ongoing biological fieldwork. Beyond his television career, he authored his first book back in 1992, well over a decade before River Monsters existed, called Somewhere Down the Crazy River, documenting early expeditions most people never heard about at the time. He followed that with a companion book to the show in 2011, and with How to Think Like a Fish in 2019, which blends decades of angling experience with broader reflections on nature, patience, and observation, without the dramatic confession narrative that's been falsely attached to it online. There's a reason this kind of embellished, shocking secret version of his story spread so easily, and it's worth naming honestly. A tidy, comforting explanation, he simply completed his mission, is true but not especially dramatic. A hidden betrayal, a secret whistleblower moment, a tearful on-camera confession, is much more shareable, even when none of it is backed by anything he's actually said. The truth here doesn't need that kind of exaggeration to be compelling. A man spent 20 unpaid, undocumented years investigating dangerous freshwater creatures on nearly every continent, survived malaria, a plane crash, an armed robbery, and an arrest as a suspected spy, then built one of the most successful nature documentary formats in television history almost by accident, and then walked away from it at the height of its popularity because he had genuinely worked through the specific mystery he set out to solve. That's the real story, and it doesn't require inventing quotes or fabricating a confrontation with a network to be worth telling. What happened after the show ended is arguably just as interesting as the show itself, precisely because it shows continuity rather than a hidden rupture. Wade didn't disappear from public life or retreat from the themes River Monsters touched on. He kept working, kept traveling, and kept applying the same investigative approach to new questions, just without the constraint of needing every episode to end with a dramatic catch. Mighty Rivers let him spend more time on the slow, grinding environmental pressures facing the world's largest waterways. Dark Waters let him apply real scientific skepticism to folklore and cryptid sightings that had never been seriously investigated on camera before. Neither series abandoned what made him credible in the first place. If anything, they extended it into territory the original show's format simply didn't have room for. It's also worth acknowledging what River Monsters actually achieved, since that part of the story is completely verifiable and doesn't need any embellishment either. The show is widely credited with bringing sustained mainstream attention to freshwater ecosystems that had historically been overshadowed by ocean-focused nature programming. It introduced global audiences to species most people had never heard of, and it did so through a format grounded in real fieldwork rather than dramatized reenactment. Multiple people who went on to study zoology, marine biology, and conservation have cited the show as part of what first got them interested in the subject. That's a real legacy, built on 9 seasons of methodical, occasionally dangerous, entirely genuine investigation, not on some hidden confession that the whole thing was secretly dishonest. So when you strip away the parts of the story that keep getting recycled without any actual sourcing, here's what's left, and it holds up. A man who spent 2 decades investigating freshwater mysteries before television ever noticed him, who built a show around solving very specific, very real reported attacks, who eventually worked through the most compelling cases available to him, and who has been fairly consistent, both during and after River Monsters, about wanting his work to say something honest about the pressures facing the rivers he spent his life exploring. He didn't need a secret to make that story worth telling. He just needed people willing to actually check what he said, instead of repeating what sounded shocking. And that, more than any invented confession, is the real reason Jeremy Wade's story is still worth paying attention to today.